Gunfire cracked the night like lightning tearing through silence. The first bullet ripped into the crowd of chanting voices, and the peaceful gathering of black activists turned instantly into a battlefield. Screams erupted, bodies stumbled, and the smell of smoke and blood fused into the air. What began as a march for justice dissolved into chaos within seconds. The protagonist froze for a heartbeat, eyes darting across the streetlights flickering on terrified faces. Then came the firebomb glass shattering, flames roaring as it consumed the banner they had carried with pride only minutes before. People scattered in every direction, stumbling over one another, some never rising again. Through the smoke and confusion, the protagonist's gaze locked onto their sibling, the one person who had always stood by them. They saw the flash before they heard it, a single shot tearing through the sibling's chest. Their body jerked backward, collapsing onto the pavement, blood blooming across their shirt. The protagonist's scream drowned beneath the roar of gunfire, their hands trembling as they crawled through the chaos, trying to reach them. But the attackers, cold deliberate, kept firing. Bullets ripped into the ground inches away. A blow struck the protagonist's temple. They collapsed, the world tilting, ears ringing with death. In those fading moments, lying beside the lifeless body of their loved one, they saw the truth in the shadows, the uniforms, the badges glinting under streetlights. This wasn't random violence. It was a sanctioned execution. The protagonists lived only because unconsciousness carried them out of notice. When they awoke hours later, bloodied and broken, the vow was carved into their soul. They would never forget, and they would make them pay. Hours before the chaos, the world had felt untouched by violence. The community center buzzed with warmth, its walls alive with laughter and the smell of home-cooked food drifting from the kitchen. Folding chairs scraped against the floor as neighbors gathered in a circle, passing notebooks and ideas, their voices full of determination but softened by trust. For the protagonist, these nights were not just meetings, they were family. Their sibling leaned across the table, nudging them with a smile. "You're too serious," they teased, sliding a paper plate with cornbread in front of them. The protagonist laughed, a sound unguarded, unscarred by grief. In that moment, they weren't warriors or targets, they were simply brothers and sisters, mothers and sons, bound by hope. Dinner at home later was no different. Their mother hummed as she stirred the pot, their father cracking jokes no one could resist. The protagonist's sibling recounted stories from the march earlier in the week, their words bright, their gestures alive with energy. The table shook with laughter, plates clinked, glasses filled and emptied. For a few hours, the weight of the world, the corruption, the threats, the whispered warnings faded. Yet, even in this peace, shadows lingered. A car idled too long outside the window before pulling away. Flyers had been ripped down from telephone poles, torn edges fluttering in the wind. The protagonist noticed these details, but pushed them aside, unwilling to taint the fragile joy of the evening. It felt like life had found a rhythm, fragile but beautiful. They didn't know it was the last time that laughter would fill that house, or that tomorrow's dawn would bring fire and gunfire instead of hope. That night, after the laughter and warmth faded into quiet, the protagonist lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The car that had lingered outside their home replayed in their mind, headlights casting strange shapes across the curtains before disappearing into the dark. It wasn't the first time. For weeks, whispers of being watched had circulated through the activist circles. Flyers torn down, messages scrawled in red paint. Stop or else. Some activists had begun checking over their shoulders every time they walked home, while others dismissed it as paranoia. But the unease was growing, threading itself into every meeting, every march, every quiet moment of rest. The next morning, the phone rang, a harsh sound that jolted the house awake. Their mother answered, her voice calm at first, then trembling. When she hung up, she said nothing, just pressed her lips together as though sealing the fear inside. The call had been brief, the voice on the other end low and distorted. "Shut it down, or you'll be shut down." The sibling brushed it off with a wave of their hand, trying to lighten the mood. "They're just cowards hiding behind phones," they said. "We can't stop now." But the protagonist saw the tremor in their hand, the flicker of doubt in their eyes. That week, during a late-night planning session, the group noticed a car parked across from the center, engine running, lights off. It sat there for hours, then vanished the moment anyone approached. Another night, two men in plain clothes were seen snapping photographs of license plates outside the meeting hall. When confronted, they smirked, offering no answers. The warnings felt less like shadows and more like a storm gathering on the horizon. Some activists grew cautious, pulling back, afraid for their families. Others pressed harder, determined to show they wouldn't be silenced. The protagonist's sibling was one of them, loud, fearless, unwilling to retreat. "They can scare us, but they can't break us," they said, raising their fist in defiance during the next rally. The crowd cheered, voices echoing in unity, even as fear pressed against their ribs like a blade. The night of the ambush began like any other. A rally under the streetlights, chants rising in rhythm, candles glowing like stars against the darkness. The protagonists stood shoulder to shoulder with their sibling voices, hoarse from shouting for justice. Families brought their children, elders carried banners. Hope flickered alive in the faces of those who refused to give up. But then came the silence, the sudden hush of the neighborhood, as though the world itself held its breath. Cars that had been circling all evening disappeared. A strange stillness fell, broken only by the rustling of paper signs and the shuffle of restless feet. The protagonist felt it first, a tightening in their chest, the same way the air grows heavy before lightning strikes. They turned to their sibling, about to speak when the night erupted. Gunfire split the air sharp, merciless, ripping through chants mid-sentence. Screams burst from the crowd as bodies fell, candles crashing to the ground, flames licking at the banners. A firebomb hurled from a speeding truck exploded against the pavement, fire sweeping across signs that moments earlier had read "Justice Now." The protagonists dove for cover, pulling their sibling down with them. But chaos was everywhere, children crying, people running blindly into bullets, smoke swallowing the air. The protagonists' ears rang, their hands shaking as they crawled forward, desperate to find safety. And then it happened. The flash, the single gunshot that tore their world apart. They saw their sibling's chest explode red, eyes wide in shock as they collapsed onto the pavement. Time slowed. The protagonist screamed, clawing toward them. But another blast cracked against their temple, sending stars across their vision. As they fell, the world tilted sideways, and in that haze of blood and smoke, they saw what the others had missed. The attackers weren't shadows, they weren't nameless thugs. They wore uniforms, badges glinting under the streetlights, faces cold and unflinching as they pulled the triggers. It wasn't random. It was execution, ordered, controlled, protected. The protagonists blacked out, the weight of their sibling's body still warm against their arm. When they awoke, the world was quiet. The street was empty except for the dead. Candles melted into pools of wax, banners reduced to ash. Their sibling's lifeless face stared upward, eyes glassy beneath the streetlight. The protagonists touched their forehead, tears cutting through the dirt and blood. Around them, the silence screamed louder than the gunfire ever had. Somewhere in that silence, a vow rooted itself deep in their soul. The system had done this. The very men sworn to protect had slaughtered their own people, erasing voices they feared. And the protagonist's card broken hollow knew in that moment that their life had shifted forever. There was no going back to laughter around the dinner table, no safety in community meetings. The fight was no longer about banners or chants. It was personal now. And the chief who ordered it's the one whose shadow lingered behind every warning. Every threat would pay. The night of the massacre never ended. Even as days passed, the sound of gunfire still echoed inside the protagonist's skull, the sharp cracks splitting silence in half, dragging them back to the pavement where their sibling's body had fallen. They couldn't close their eyes without seeing it again, the flash, the chest caving, the life draining from eyes that had once been so alive. Sleep brought no rest, only nightmares that forced them awake with screams lodged in their throat, drenched in sweat, reaching out for a hand that would never reach back. Funerals came in waves, coffins lowered one by one, prayers whispered, families clutching folded flags and each other as though holding on to the last pieces of their broken hearts. The protagonist stood among them, hollow shadow of the person who had once laughed over cornbread and whispered about dreams of change. Their sibling's grave was fresh earth, damp and heavy, a mound of soil that looked too small to hold someone so full of life. The protagonists knelt until their knees ached, pressing their hand into the dirt as if they could anchor their loved one back to this world. The community, once vibrant and defiant, was silenced. Meetings that used to buzz with energy now sat in suffocating quiet, chairs empty, voices gone. Those who survived kept their heads down, eyes darting to the streets. Whispers cut short at the sight of a police cruiser rolling by. Flyers no longer hung from telephone poles. Candles no longer lit vigils. Fear had finished what bullets began. The protagonist wandered through this silence like a ghost. Their body moved, but their soul felt stuck in that single moment of gunfire. Guilt gnawed at them, sharper than grief. Why did I live? Why not them? Every reflection was a stranger's face, eyes sunken, skin pale, a hollow stare. They remembered the warmth of their sibling's hand, now cold in memory, and felt themselves shrinking beneath the weight of survival. Nights became longer than days. They turned to the bottle, pouring whiskey into cracked glasses, drowning the voices that never stopped. At first it was just enough to fall asleep, but soon it was enough to forget, enough to blur the faces, the fire, the smell of blood. Each drink dulled the edges of reality, though the pain always returned sharper the next morning. Their hands shook, their body ached, their mind whispered that maybe it would be easier to join the dead than keep walking through this hell, that the isolation grew. Friends who once sat beside them grew distant, either too afraid to associate with a survivor or too wrapped in their own grief to reach out. Calls went unanswered, doors stayed closed. The protagonists stopped showing up to meetings, stopped eating at the family table, stopped speaking unless forced to. They lived in the small, suffocating room of their own guilt. The walls seemed to close in tighter each day. Some nights they sat at the edge of their sibling's bed, staring at the posters still hanging on the walls, the books left half-read on the desk. Their sibling's voice echoed in their mind-laughter speeches, even small arguments that seemed so trivial once. The silence afterward was unbearable. On one night, trembling hands reached for the revolver hidden in the drawer. The cold steel sat heavy in their palm, almost comforting in its finality. They pressed it against their temple, breath-catching, tears streaking their face. For one heartbeat, it seemed like an answer. But the memories stopped them, not the violent ones, but the softer ones, late-night talks under blankets. The way their siblings' eyes shone when they spoke about building a better world. If we stop, they win. The words echoed, shaking the protagonist's hand until the revolver clattered back into the drawer. Survival still felt like punishment, but ending it would mean surrendering the last fragment of their sibling's dream. Still, the darkness did not lift. They stumbled through days, avoiding eyes, drowning in liquor, drifting closer to a breaking point. The system outside pressed harder. Police cars parked near their home for hours. Neighbors warned to stay quiet. Families threatened with consequences if they dared speak out. Reports on the news painted the massacre as a riot gone wrong, framing activists as violent agitators. The chief stood on television, polished and calm, shaking hands with city officials, his voice dripping with false sympathy as he promised a thorough investigation. The protagonist threw a glass at the screen, shattering it, blood dripping from their knuckles as they screamed into the empty room. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was betrayal. The world had swallowed the truth, spat back lies, and left the dead forgotten. Their sibling's name was being erased, twisted into something it had never been. The protagonist felt powerless, a single voice screaming against a storm. But somewhere in that desperation, a spark flickered. Not of hope. Hope felt too fragile, too far gone, but of rage. A raw, smoldering anger that cut through the fog of whiskey and despair. The thought grew louder each night. If no one else will fight, then I will. They began writing in notebooks again, hands trembling as they scribbled memories, times, faces. They wrote about the men with badges, the warnings, the threats. It felt like clinging to sanity, but it also felt dangerous, like standing too close to a fire. Every page carried the risk of discovery, but the alternative silence felt worse. Even as they tried, the weight of their guilt pressed down harder. They visited the gravesite in the middle of the night, collapsing against the earth, sobbing into the soil. "I'm sorry," they whispered, again and again, the words spilling out like confession. "I should have saved you. I should have taken the bullet." The earth did not answer. The silence pressed heavier. The protagonist was unraveling, broken, hollow, trapped between grief and rage, life and death. Each day was a battle just to breathe, each night a war with memories that refused to let go. They didn't yet know what to do, or how to stand against the storm. But in that desperation, beneath the wreckage of their spirit, something else was forming. Not strength, not yet, not resolve, not fully, but a seed of defiance, a shadow of the person they once were, the kind of seed that, given enough pain, would grow into something unrecognizable. And though they didn't know it then, the silence that had crushed them would soon sharpen into the kind of scream that tears walls down, a scream not only of grief but of vengeance. The seed of defiance growing inside the protagonist found a face to take root against. The chief, on television, he appeared untouchable. His uniform pressed to perfection, his badge gleaming beneath the bright lights, his smile warm, even fatherly. To the city, he was a man of order, a protector, a pillar of the community. Reporters flocked to his words. Families nodded with admiration when he spoke of safety, and politicians shook his hand as though touching power itself. At the funerals, he stood with folded hands and bowed head, whispering condolences into microphones. "We mourn with you," he said. "We will not rest until the truth is uncovered." Cameras flashed. Mothers wept in his presence, believing him a man of compassion. But behind his eyes, There was only calculation, because the protagonist had seen the truth badges in the shadows, uniforms glinting in firelight. The chief wasn't a bystander. He was the architect. The massacre had been no accident, no riot gone wrong, but a message. Dissent would be buried beneath bullets. Justice would be silenced by fear. Behind closed doors, the chief was different. In dimly lit back rooms of the station, his smile vanished, replaced by a cold, ruthless stare. He paced like a predator, paranoia dripping from every step. His voice was sharp, barking orders with no hesitation. No loose ends, no leaks. I don't want a single activist left standing who dares to speak. The officers under him obeyed, though not all with the same conviction. There was Captain Rowe, ambitious, eager to please, whose loyalty to the chief wasn't born from fear but hunger. He wanted rank, power, a seat at the table where decisions were made. To him, blood on the streets was simply the cost of climbing the ladder. He followed orders without flinching, seeing every dead activist as a stepping stone to his own rise. Then there was Sergeant Kane, hardened, weary, his face carved by years of battles with enemies both real and imagined. Once, perhaps, he had believed in justice, but decades of compromise, of turning away, had twisted him into something else. He still drank to silence the guilt, but his hands never trembled when loading his gun. Kane didn't kill out of ambition, he killed because the system demanded it, and he no longer had the strength to resist. Officer Mallory was different. Young, nervous, eyes flickering whenever the chief barked commands. He hadn't yet built the armor to hide his fear. His conscience still bled through, but fear bound him tighter than chains. He fired his weapon that night because not firing meant turning his back on men who could destroy him in a heartbeat. Mallory carried the massacre in his eyes, but he wore his silence like a shield. Each of them formed the chief's circle: loyalists, opportunists, and the broken. Together, they were AWOL, shielding him from suspicion. When questions arose, they provided answers rehearsed to perfection. When witnesses stirred, they silenced them with threats, or worse. They didn't need orders spelled out, just a glance, a nod, and the work was done. But cracks existed, faint and almost invisible. Rowe's arrogance made him careless, too confident in his invincibility. Kane's drinking left him vulnerable, words slipping after too much whiskey, truths spilling when lips loosened. And Mallory's guilt gnawed at him, leaving trails in his behavior, hesitation in his eyes, shadows of doubt that the protagonist, if they looked closely enough, could one day exploit. The chief knew these flaws, but his paranoia blinded him. He trusted no one completely, not even those who pledged loyalty. His obsession with control grew by the day. He demanded reports on every activist's movement, lists of every meeting, photographs of every leader. He called late at night, summoning his men for whispered strategy sessions in abandoned warehouses or locked offices, always watching, always suspecting. And beneath his paranoia, rage simmered. He hated the activists not just because they threatened his power, but because they reminded him of what he could never control: the truth, their voices, their unity, their defiance. Killing them was never just about silencing dissent. It was about breaking the spirit of an entire community. He wanted fear to seep into every home, every street, until no one dared raise their voice again. Yet even in his ruthlessness, he played the part of savior. At City Hall meetings, he spoke of progress. At school assemblies, he shook children's hands, telling them he worked to keep their future safe. Church leaders invited him to sit in front pews, praising his dedication to peace. The mask was flawless, and the city believed in it, but masks slip in the dark. In the hours after the massacre, when the city slept, he paced his office alone. He replayed reports, circled names, crossed out faces with a heavy pen. Each stroke was a sentence, a quiet death. His paranoia whispered that survivors might remain, that someone might rise from the ashes. He ordered his men to keep watch, to search hospitals, to sniff out voices that dared to whisper the truth. If anyone survived, he growled, make sure they don't for long. The protagonist, though drowning in grief and silence, began to see the shape of this monster in the shadows. The chief was not simply a man. He was the embodiment of the system itself, smiling in public, striking in private, feeding on loyalty, ambition, and fear. To destroy him would not just mean confronting one man, but the entire machine that shielded him. For now, the chief stood untouchable, his circle of men a fortress. But the cracks were there: Rowe's arrogance, Kane's haunted weakness, Mallory's trembling conscience. The protagonist didn't yet know how to use them, but deep down, they felt it. Those flaws were threads, and threads, when pulled hard enough, could unravel even the strongest wall. What the chief didn't realize, in his paranoia and pride, was that his greatest mistake had already been made. He had left one survivor, one voice, one broken soul who, beneath the weight of grief, was learning to stand again, and that survivor was watching. The chief believed silence had been secured, that fear had sealed the city's lips, that the last survivor was too broken to ever rise. It was wrong. Grief still choked the protagonist. But beneath its weight something was shifting. The endless nights of liquor-soaked despair began to give way to something sharper, anger with teeth. Anger that refused to stay buried. Each time they saw the chief's smug face on the television, smiling, promising justice, it burned like acid in their veins. Each time they passed their sibling's room, untouched and frozen in time, the vow inside them sharpened. They couldn't stay a ghost. They had to act that it began small. Late at night, when the streets were quiet, they walked the places they once avoided, the alley where the car had idled too long, the telephone poles where flyers had been torn down. They retraced steps, piecing together fragments. In the ashes of the burned banners, they found shards of glass from the firebomb, stashed them away in an old box. Each fragment felt like a piece of the truth, a piece of the chief's lie splintering. The first witness they approached nearly slammed the door in their face. Fear had spread deeper than any wound. "Don't ask me," the woman whispered through the crack. "They'll kill us all if we talk." But the protagonist pressed, voice trembling yet relentless. "They already did, and if we stay silent, they win." She didn't open the door, but she slid a folded slip of paper through the gap, a license plate number she had written down that night. It was a start. Days blurred into nights as the survivor built a hidden wall of evidence. They scribbled names, numbers, locations in notebooks, mapping out patterns. The chief's men weren't as invisible as they thought. Rowe always left meetings late at the same bar, arrogance making him careless. Kane, drunk, had once let slip that orders came from the top, and Mallory, his hesitation hadn't gone unnoticed. The survivor followed him one night, watching the young officer smoke alone, staring at his hands as though blood still stained them. Each piece of knowledge was a weapon, yet with each discovery came a heavier question: what to do with it? Some nights rage screamed the answer: kill them one by one, spill their blood as they had spilled innocent lives. Other nights, the whisper of conscience clawed through: if I kill them, am I any different? Am I just another murderer? The survivors' dreams split in two. Some ended with vengeance, others with their own hands covered in blood, their sibling's voice asking, "Is this what we fought for?" The conflict tore them apart. At their sibling's grave, they confessed it all. "I want to burn them for what they did, but I don't know if I can carry it. If I kill them, does that mean they already won? Because then I'll be them." The grave gave no answer, only silence. The only reply was the weight of memory, the smile that had once teased, the voice that had once shouted hope. The turning point came in the form of betrayal. One of the few remaining activists, a longtime friend, pulled them aside after a hushed meeting. "Stop digging," he warned. "You think you're being brave, but you're just painting a target on your back." When pressed, his eyes dropped. "They know you're looking. The chief knows. You're alive only because he's letting you breathe." That night, a brick shattered their window, a note tied to it: "Stay quiet, or join your brother in the ground." The message was clear: survival was no accident. It was permitted. Elish Dutt, the survivor, stood over the shards of glass on the floor, chest heaving. For the first time, despair didn't drown them, ignited them. They weren't alive because the chief allowed it. They were alive because the chief made a mistake, and mistakes could be corrected. From then on, the survivor changed. They stopped drinking. Their hands steadied, their eyes sharpened. The grief didn't vanish, but it hardened into something else. They began moving like a shadow, careful, calculating. They memorized schedules, noted weaknesses, studied the cracks in the chief's circle. Rowe's arrogant, Kane's whiskey, Mallory's guilt. Each flaw was a thread waiting to be pulled. They became a hunter. It wasn't immediate. Fear still lingered, whispering caution with every step, but determination drowned it out. They began tailing Rowe, sitting in the back of bars, listening, piecing together names of those bribed to keep silent. They crept into alleys behind the station, photographing cars, collecting proof. They stole discarded reports from trash bins, piecing them back together like jigsaw puzzles. The survivor's world shrank to two things: memory and mission. Every laugh shared at dinner tables, every promise shouted at rallies became fuel. Every lie told on television, every false smile of the chief was tinder still. The moral conflict gnawed at them. Each night they asked the same question: revenge or justice? If they exposed the chief, would the system protect him? If they killed him, would it bury them too? There was no clear answer, only the suffocating awareness that both paths carried death, one of the chief, or one of their own soul. But the choice no longer felt optional. The chief had already decided their fate the night he sent bullets into the crowd. Silence was death. Action, even at the cost of everything, was the only way forward. One night, standing in front of the mirror, they barely recognized the person staring back. The hollowed eyes were gone, replaced with something sharper, colder. They whispered to the reflection, steady and clear, "You wanted me broken. Instead, you made me this." From that moment, there was no turning back. The survivor still carried guilt, still woke to nightmares, still visited the grave in quiet moments of weakness. But now, each visit ended not with sobs but with promises. "I'll make them answer. I'll make them bleed truth." The grave no longer felt like an end. It felt like a starting point. The chief had his circle, his fortress, his lies. But the survivor had something stronger, age sharpened by grief, truth stitched together with determination, and nothing left to lose. They were no longer just a victim, no longer just a mourner. They had become the shadow that the chief's paranoia always feared would rise. The one survivor he tried to erase had turned into something far more dangerous, a hunter. And the hunt had just begun. The hunt had begun, but the survivor quickly learned that the prey they pursued was shielded by an entire machine. The chief was not just a man in uniform. He was the system itself, city officials, officers, judges, and businessmen bound together by power and fear. To touch him meant touching all of them, and they would not go down quietly. The first wall was the press. Every attempt to share the truth was swallowed by silence. Reporters the survivor trusted once turned away, avoiding eye contact, their voices brittle with excuses. "I'm sorry, my editor won't run this story." Others laughed nervously, changing the subject. Newspapers ran headlines that painted the massacre as the activists' fault. Protest spirals into violence, police respond. Television anchors parroted the same script. Law enforcement acted to protect citizens. The chief's smile was everywhere, the face of authority untouchable. Even within the community, the survivor faced resistance. Friends who once marched beside them now crossed the street to avoid being seen. Old allies whispered warnings. "You need to stop," one said, grabbing the survivor's arm, voice low with panic. "You're going to get yourself killed, and us too." The survivor shook them off, eyes burning. "They already killed us. You just haven't buried yourself yet." But the friend's eyes carried only fear. The survivor pressed on, following threads, documenting names and movements. That's when the betrayal struck. A confidant, someone they had trusted, someone who had cried at their sibling's grave. At first, the survivor didn't know. They only noticed more shadows trailing them, more doors slammed in their face, more eyes watching from the alleys. Then came the night when footsteps echoed too close behind. The survivor ducked into a side street, heart pounding, only to see two men in plain clothes close in. One reached for his weapon, whispering into a radio dot. It was a setup. Their confidant had spoken. The survivor bolted, lungs tearing for air, sneakers slapping against cracked pavement. Gunfire cracked behind them, sparks exploding as bullets ricocheted off brick walls. They ducked into an abandoned warehouse, weaving through rusted beams and broken glass, heart hammering so loud it drowned the city's silence. A bullet grazed their arm, hot pain slicing across skin, but adrenaline kept them moving. They dove out a broken window, glass tearing into flesh, and rolled onto the street below. Somehow, in the chaos, they slipped away, limping into the shadows until the footsteps faded. Blood dripped into their palm, breaths ragged. But they were alive, barely, and that survival told them one thing: this was no longer just about revenge. It was survival. The system was striking back harder. The next morning, officers raided their family's home. Uniforms stormed in, shouting orders, ripping drawers from cabinets, scattering belongings across the floor. Their mother wept as photographs were torn from walls, the sibling's image trampled under heavy boots. When the survivor demanded a warrant, the officers sneered. "You people don't need one." They left with nothing. But the message was clear: we can reach into your home whenever we choose. False charges followed. Flyers appeared around town, claiming the survivor was armed and dangerous, a known agitator with a violent record. Mugshots salted, fabricated, circulated online, branding them a criminal. Neighbors began to look differently, suspicion clouding eyes that once held sympathy. Employers who had once offered work cut ties. "We can't be associated with you," they said, their voices trembling with both pity and fear. The threats grew darker. Anonymous letters slipped under the door. "We know where you sleep." Spray-painted warnings scarred the side of the house. "Next time, it's you." Their remaining family lived in constant fear, curtains drawn, lights kept low, the sound of every car outside sparking dread. One evening their younger cousin didn't come home from school until hours later, lost, crying, after being followed by men she didn't recognize. The survivor realized then that the system wasn't just coming for them, it was reaching for everyone they loved. Desperation clawed at their chest. How do you fight a machine that owns every street, every office, every headline? Rage threatened to overwhelm them, to drive them into reckless action. They wanted to storm into the chief's office, to scream the truth in his face, to end it all in one final burst of fire. But instinct held them back. Recklessness meant death, and not just theirs, but their families. Still, the conflict inside tore them apart. Each night, the same question whispered, am I seeking justice, or am I just hungry for blood? Their siblings' face haunted them, sometimes urging restraint, other times urging fire. Their dreams blurred the two until they woke drenched in sweat, fists clenched around nothing. They started moving like prey even as they hunted, always looking over their shoulder, always memorizing exits, always sleeping with a knife under the pillow. They learned to trust no one. Friends had become dangers, allies turned into spies. The betrayal cut deep, a wound worse than any bullet. Yet even as the walls closed in, determination hardened. They realized survival was resistance. Every breath they took was defiance. Every scrap of evidence they gathered was a strike against the chief's lie. The system wanted them erased, silenced, broken, but they refused to vanish. One night, after weeks of being shadowed, the survivor set a trap. They walked the streets slowly, letting their tail close in, turning a corner into a dead end. They waited, heart pounding. 2 men followed, smirking, sure of their victory. But the survivor had already loosened the fire escape ladder above. As the men reached, the survivor yanked it down, metal crashing, blocking the exit. In the confusion, they bolted, vanishing into the night. For once it was the system left chasing shadows. But victories were fleeting. The machine was vast, and every small triumph felt swallowed by its enormity. The chief tightened his grip, his paranoia growing. More raids, more arrests, more propaganda. The city itself began to suffocate, the air thick with fear. The survivor's family begged them to stop. Please, their mother whispered, clutching their hands with tears streaming down her face. Don't make me bury another child. The words tore through them, sharper than any bullet. But stopping was no longer possible, because beneath the fear, something else stirred a grim clarity. This wasn't about vengeance alone. It wasn't even about justice in the way the system defined it. It was survival. Their own survival, their family's survival, their community's survival. To stop was to die. To fight was to live, even if it meant living with blood on their hands. The system had thrown everything at them, but bullets, falsehoods, fear, and still, they stood, bruised, bleeding, hunted, yes but alive, and each breath was a promise. They would not be erased. The chief thought the machine he built was unbreakable, but machines rust, walls crack, and prey, when pushed too far, learns to bite. The survivor wiped the blood from their arm, straightened their back, and whispered to the night, if survival is the only choice, then I will survive by becoming the thing you fear most. And with that, the hunter sharpened their claws. The survivor's vow had sharpened into steel, but steel alone could not pierce the fortress the chief had built. They needed more evidence, timing, precision. For weeks they gathered scraps, photographs of unmarked cars outside rallies, recordings of drunken confessions from Kane, whispers of secret meetings where orders had been passed down. Piece by piece, they wove a net, but nets were only useful if they could be thrown at the right moment. That moment came when whispers reached them. The chief was holding a private meeting at the old community hall, the same place where activists had once gathered, the same place that now stood in ruins from fire and bullets. It was symbolic, deliberate. He wanted to remind his circle of power, to stand among the ashes of those he had silenced. The survivor felt their chest tighten as they approached the building. The night was heavy, moonlight spilling across broken windows and charred wood. Every step echoed memory, the chants that once filled the hall, the laughter of their sibling, the firebomb that had torn it apart. Now silence ruled, except for the muffled voices within. They slipped inside, moving through shadows. The chief stood at the front, coat draped across broad shoulders. His officers gathered around. His voice carried the same confidence it always did. Fear keeps them quiet, and as long as they're quiet, we win. That's the way it works. That's the way it's always worked. The survivor stepped forward, letting the dim light reveal their face. The room froze. Rose's smirk faltered. Kane's eyes widened. Mallory shifted with visible dread, but it was the chief who broke the silence with a low chuckle. While he said, voice dripping with mockery, "The ghost returns." The survivor's fists tightened. "I'm not a ghost. I'm the one you missed." The chief waved his hand, dismissive. "You think anyone will believe you? You're a drunk, a criminal, a nobody. Your name is dirt, your story erased. You have nothing." But the survivor's voice was steady. "I have the truth, and I have proof." They dropped the bag they carried, spilling photos, tapes, and documents across the floor. The officer's eyes darted. Recognizing the damning evidence rose drunken boasts. Kane's slip of the tongue, Mallory's hesitation captured in grainy video. The chief's jaw tightened, though his smile never fully vanished. "Proof?" he sneered. "Of what?" "That men do their jobs. That sometimes people get hurt. You can dress it however you want, but at the end of the day, you're alone. Who will believe you over me? A respected chief, a protector, a savior." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming like steel. "You're nothing but a survivor, too stubborn to stay buried." The words sliced, but they did not break. The survivor stood taller, their chest heaving. For a moment, silence pressed against the walls, heavy with the weight of years of grief and rage. Then, slowly, they drew the revolver from their coat, raising it toward the chief. Gasps filled the room. Rowe reached for his holster, Kane froze, and Mallory's face turned pale. The chief, however, didn't flinch. He smirked, spreading his arms wide, as if inviting the bullet. "Go ahead," he taunted. "Pull the trigger, become what you claim to hate. You want vengeance. Take it. But remember, if you kill me, you prove me right. You're no different than the animals you pretend to fight for." The survivor's hand shook, finger hovering over the trigger. Sweat dripped down their temple, breath ragged. Every nightmare, every grave, every drop of blood cried out for this moment. The image of their sibling's body on the pavement burned behind their eyes. Killing him would feel like justice. And yet their sibling's voice whispered in memory, "If we stop, they win." Their chest ached. Was this justice or just another massacre waiting to happen, one they'd authored with their own hand? The chief saw the hesitation and pressed harder. "You're weak. That's why your people die screaming in the streets, because they follow cowards like you. Kill me, and you vanish. Spare me, and I'll destroy you anyway. Either way, you lose." For a moment, time fractured. The survivor saw two futures, one where they pulled the trigger, blood pooling at the chief's feet, silence swallowing the room. Another where they lowered the gun, only to watch their evidence buried, their voice smothered, their family hunted until none remained. They wanted to scream, to tear the choice apart with their hands. But choices don't break. They only cut. With a trembling breath, they forced a decision. The gun roared, louder than memory, louder than grief. The bullet slammed into the chief's chest, his smirk freezing into shock before blood spilled across his uniform. He staggered, eyes wide, then collapsed onto the charred floorboards where activists had once stood. The officers erupted. Rowe drew his gun. Kane shouted. Mallory froze in horror. But the survivor didn't hear them. Their ears rang with the sound of vengeance, their hands numb as the revolver slipped from their grip. They had done it. They had ended him. But as they stared at the lifeless body, a hollow truth gnawed at them. Nothing had changed. The machine still stood. Rowe would rise. Kane would obey. Mallory would remain silent. The chief was gone, but the system breathed on. And inside, the survivor felt no victory, only emptiness. The survivor lowered the gun, tears streaking their face. "No," they whispered. "You don't get to make me like you." The chief's smirk returned, smug and triumphant. Pathetic. But then, the survivor kicked the bag of evidence forward. "This isn't about bullets. It's about truth. And truth spreads faster than fear." Mallory bent down, trembling as he looked at the photos, the recordings. His hands shook as though the weight of guilt had finally broken him. For the first time, he spoke against the chief. "It's all true," he muttered. The room erupted in shouts, Rowe denying, Kane glaring, but the crack had formed. The mask was slipping. The chief lunged, seizing the bag, but the survivor stepped between them. "You can bury bodies, you can burn banners, but you can't kill the truth forever." The chief's hand hovered near his holster. For a heartbeat, it seemed he would end it there. But then, the sound of sirens split the air outside. Activists, journalists, even federal agents the survivor had secretly leaked evidence to, storming the building. The chief's fortress was crumbling, and yet, as the chief was dragged away, he locked eyes with the survivor, smirking even in cuffs. "This isn't over. The system doesn't fall with one man, and you will never outrun it." The words clung, a poison in the air. Victory tasted of ash, Whichever path the survivor chose, blood or exposure, the consequences were the same. Nothing felt whole. Justice was not clean, revenge was not pure. Their sibling was still gone. The graves were still full. The machines still loomed as dawn broke over the ruined hall. The survivor stood alone, revolver heavy in one hand, evidence heavy in the other. One path left them branded a murderer, the other left them forever hunted by the system's shadow. Either way, they were changed, and in the silence, they finally understood. Survival was not triumph. Survival was a curse. Dawn bled into the sky like a wound that refused to close. The hall where everything had begun and ended stood silent once more, charred, broken, and soaked in the echoes of voices that could never return. The survivor emerged from it alone, carrying the weight of a choice that no sunrise could erase. Whether by bullet or by exposure, the chief was gone. Justice, in some fractured form, had been won, but the cost was carved into their soul, deeper than any victory could soothe. If they had pulled the trigger, the memory lingered like a ghost, the chief's smirk shattering into shock, the blood blooming across his chest, the silence that followed. The survivor could still feel the recoil in their hand, the numbness in their bones. Everyone had wanted the monster dead, but killing him didn't bring back the laughter that once filled their home. Didn't erase the smell of fire or the sound of bullets ripping through chants of hope. It didn't resurrect their sibling. It only left another body on the floor, another life swallowed by violence. If they had chosen exposure, the image was no less haunting. The chief dragged out in cuffs, his eyes gleaming with venom even as his mask crumbled. The city reeled at the revelation, officials scrambling, the machine fractured but not fallen. And yet, even in defeat, he had whispered words that clung like chains. The system doesn't fall with one man. The survivor knew he was right. The chief might rot in a cell, but the rot of the system remained. His allies would rise, his methods would survive, his legacy of fear would linger. Either way, the survivor walked into a future that felt hollow, that friends were gone. Many had died in the massacre. Others had scattered, too afraid to ever stand again. The community was broken, its once vibrant spirit reduced to whispers behind locked doors. Some cursed the survivor in secret, blaming them for drawing more fire. Others praised them as a hero, a savior, but the survivor felt neither. They were neither villain nor hero, only someone who had carried fire too long and been burned by it. The family was not whole. Their mother's eyes, once warm, now carried only grief, a sadness that no words could mend. The empty chair at the table where their sibling once sat was a wound that would never heal. Every meal tasted of absence. Every prayer was stitched with loss. The survivor sat there, silent, unable to offer comfort. They had promised justice, but justice had not restored what mattered most, and inside the inner peace that once defined them was shattered. Nights brought no sleep, only the same memories looping endlessly. The sound of gunfire, the image of their sibling's body hitting the ground, the chief's taunts echoing in the dark. Some nights they woke with their own scream in their throat, reaching for a weapon even in their sleep. Other nights they sat in silence until dawn, staring at walls that felt like tombstones. One evening, unable to stay indoors any longer, they walked to the cemetery. The graves stretched endlessly, a silent city of the lost. They stopped at the one that mattered most, the mound of earth where their sibling rested, marked by a stone too small for the life it represented. Kneeling, they pressed a trembling hand against the cold granite. "It's done," they whispered, voice cracking. "He's gone. I made sure of it." Tears blurred their vision, spilling hot down their face. "But I don't know if I won anything. You're still here, and I'm still alone. I thought killing him or exposing him would mean something, but it doesn't. It doesn't bring you back." The wind stirred, carrying the faint sound of church bells in the distance. For a moment, they imagined hearing their sibling's voice in it, soft and alive. But it was only memory, cruel in its persistence. They stayed there for hours, the silence broken only by sobs and whispers. When they finally stood, their legs felt like stone. They caught their reflection in a shard of polished granite from another grave marker. The face that stared back was not the one they remembered from before, the hollow eyes, the hardened jaw, the shadow of violence etched into every line. They barely recognized themselves. In that moment, they understood the truth they had avoided all along. Revenge had consumed them. It had given them strength, yes, but it had also taken everything else. They had become a weapon, and weapons don't heal, they destroy. The city around them moved on. Headlines shifted. New scandals replaced old ones. People returned to their routines. The massacre faded from the news. The chief's name either cursed or forgotten depending on the mouth that spoke it. Life went on, indifferent. But for the survivor, time was frozen. They remained in the night of fire, in the gunshots, in the loss that never stopped bleeding. There were moments when they tried to imagine a future walking away, building something new, leaving the ruins behind, but every path ended the same, with the weight of graves chained to their back. No matter how far they walked, they carried the cemetery with them. In quiet hours, they stood before the mirror, staring at their reflection. Sometimes they whispered to it, "Are you still human? Or did you become him?" The reflection never answered, only stared back with hollow eyes. And yet, beneath the ruin, a faint ember remained. Not hope, not in the way their sibling once carried it, but something quieter, something grim. The understanding that survival itself was defiance. That every breath they took was a rejection of the system's attempt to erase them. That perhaps, even if broken, their existence meant the chief hadn't won entirely, but it was a bitter ember, one that did not warm. In the end, the survivor walked the line between justice and destruction, haunted by both. They had won, in the sense that the chief no longer breathed power into the city, but they had lost in every other way: family, community, peace, themselves. The final scene was not of victory nor of despair, but of reflection. Standing at the grave, their shadows stretched long in the dying light. They placed a hand on the cold stone, whispering a promise only the dead could hear. "I made him pay, but it cost me everything." And as they turned away, the cemetery behind them, the weight of silence followed like a second shadow, proof that sometimes justice is just another name for loss.